So last time I mentioned I'd give you guys sort of an introduction to genetics and DNA. And now we're going to talk about just a brief little introduction to transcription and translation. And this is essentially following back to what I talked about with the central dogma of molecular biology. Where you have DNA, and then whenever you transcribe it, you end up with RNA, and then you end up with protein. So, like I mentioned before, the process of converting DNA into RNA is referred to as transcription. And then converting RNA into protein is referred to as translation. And when it comes to almost 99% of all your genes in your genome, to get a certain protein or an RNA, you would essentially follow this step where if you have a gene that encodes for like a flower color or something like that, a protein that controls color, you would have to first transcribe that gene into RNA, and then this RNA will be interpreted by tRNA in a ribosome in a process called translation to give you a fully functional protein. Another thing to also go over is that some viral particles are only composed of RNA in their genomes. So what they have is they have something called a reverse transcriptase. Where they can convert their RNA back into DNA, which they can insert into a genome of an animal or of a cell, and then they can undergo the dogma of biology again. They can undergo that whole entire process to avoid detection by the cell. So basically, to give you a little bit of an introduction to RNA, RNA is a little bit different from DNA in that RNA has a ribose sugar, whereas DNA has a deoxyribose sugar. So the way how this would look is RNA would have, and they would have essentially the same thing, a phosphate group. They would have a 5' carbon. They would have a base here, could be variable, but what they would have is 2 hydroxyl groups on the 2' end and on the 3' end. So this would be your RNA. Your DNA, on the other hand, if you can remember, it basically has a phosphate group connected to a 5' end, and then you only have one hydroxyl group on the 3' end, and only on the 3' end. So this is basically one of the main differences. Another difference between RNA and DNA is that RNA, if you can look at this image right here, has one difference where RNA doesn't have any thymines. Instead, RNA uses uracil to complementary bind to adenines. So RNA does not use thymine, but rather yours. So those are the primary main differences between the two. And additionally, the RNA sequences that you end up developing, they're not double-stranded, but rather single-stranded. So that's something to take note of. And basically what happens is you have this mRNA sequence and you pull it into something called a ribosome. And this ribosome is going to, using these tRNAs, is going to interpret what the sequence is and add appropriate amino acids to your growing polypeptide chain. So the way how you can think about the difference between, I know some people struggle on remembering what transcription is and translation. Transcription is essentially you're basically transcribing the same language into like a kind of a similar format, right? But translation, on the other hand, is you're translating something into a completely different language, which is proteins. So if you ever get confused on the difference between them, just remember that transcription, you're not really changing the format of your language, you're just rewriting in a different way. But rather, translation is you're translating one language, which is, DNA nucleotides to RNA, which they're fairly similar. But translation, you're changing that into something that is completely different, like proteins. But that's basically the entire sort of introduction to these. So, and that'll be sort of it for the introduction chapter, which most of you probably already, had a pretty good introduction to all of these, from like the intro level biology classes. So now we're going into the fun part where we're talking about like Mendelian genetics and how certain genes are passed on. What are the mechanisms for genes being passed on from one individual to another individual. So I'll see you then.